I am a massive George Harrison fan. I've always loved his stuff with the Beatles, but in recent years I've also been discovering just how good his solo work is. His debut solo album, All Things Must Pass, is easily as good as a Beatles record. But it's a song from the latter part of his solo career that recently caught my ear. The second single from his 1987 album Cloud 9 is a song written all about his time in the Beatles, a song called When We Was Fab, in the lyrics of which he reflects back on all the madness of Beatlemania in the 1960s. But the song is actually much more than that. It really is a fitting tribute to his former band because it doesn't just work on the surface level. This is a single packed with intentional Easter eggs, hidden meanings and multi-layered buried references, as were so many of the Beatles' works. After first listening to the song, I was immediately hooked. I could hear all kinds of random callbacks and borrowed moments from the Beatles' back catalogue. But it was when I watched the music video that I slowly started to notice a little bit of a pattern emerging. Hey look, there's George in the Sgt. Pepper's outfit. And here's a freeze frame of that shot next to one of the original Pepper publicity shots, so that's definitely a reference. And at the end of the song there is a sitar part that sounds very similar to George's sitar part on the song Within You, Without You, which was the only song he wrote for that album. Elsewhere in the video we see a left-handed bass player wearing John Lennon's walrus costume from the Magical Mystery Tour movie and album. So that again clearly is another reference back to a different album. In the very last section of the song, George literally sings You Really Got a Hold on Me, which is the title of one of their cover songs from With the Beatles. So there, right on the surface, were three blatant references to three different Beatles albums, there in the music and the video. And those three were totally obvious on a first watch. So, with my curiosity now growing, I decided to re-watch the video and re-listen to the song to see if there were any more. And of course there were. There's a line in the lyrics that says, back when income tax was all we had, and that looks very much like a callback to one of George's songs on Revolver, Taxman. And here's the cover to the single, a direct reference again to the Revolver album cover, with an updated version of George in the 80s by the same artist. But there were also other Beatles references and callbacks that were perhaps a little less obvious, perhaps just a little more buried and concealed. And as I slowly began to uncover some of these other references and callbacks, it began to dawn on me that George was ticking off Beatles albums. Each reference I found seemed to come from a different era and a different album. And so I set myself the mission to try and find them all. The next song I found a reference to, again from a different album, was Glass Onion from the White Album. And we've actually already seen the first reference to that song. A left-handed bass player wearing the walrus costume. In the original video for I Am the Walrus, the bass player actually wasn't wearing that suit. Putting a left-handed bass player in the walrus suit is a direct reference to a line from Glass Onion that says, here's another clue for you all, the walrus was Paul. The opening line of the song literally uses the exact same two chords as Glass Onion. That's an A minor and an F7. And apparently, George Harrison also asked Ringo, who drums on the track and features in the video, to play a drum part based on Glass Onion as well. So there we have the same opening chords as Glass Onion, an A minor and an F7, and we have a drum part inspired by it. That's the White Album also ticked off the list. Towards the end of the video, we see that George is singing on one side of a wall, behind which are cartoon landmarks from cities of the world, which have been animated in the style of the Yellow Submarine film and album. That is the only cartoon moment in the entire music video, and it matches that strange Python-esque psychedelic style. So I'm taking that as the reference and callback to Yellow Submarine. And so at this point I was up to 6 Beatles album references. And there are only 13 albums, 14 if you count Past Masters. As I continued combing through the video and the song, I began to feel like I'd got all the most obvious ones, so it was time to start digging just a little deeper. In an interview with Uncut magazine in 2020, co-writer Jeff Lynne said of When We Was Fab, "It came out really well. I was so thrilled with all the little puns and innuendos." So from that we can take that he and George did fill the song with hidden meanings and double meanings all throughout. Let's look at a possible example from the music video. At the end of the video, we get this very strange moment where George transforms into an 8-armed person. The first time I saw it, I wondered if perhaps it was a reference to his well-known Hindu beliefs. But then, I remembered the original title for the Beatles album and film, Help, was 8 Arms to Hold You. Here is the original label for the US Ticket to Ride single. And look what it calls the next album. Not Help, but 8 Arms to Hold You. And there is a Beatle with 8 arms in the video. So, I'm taking that as another reference. I think we've just got Help. At this point, I had hit the halfway mark. That was 7 Beatles albums referenced out of a possible 14. And then I noticed this in the video. 2 hands appear out of Harrison's jacket, and for a few seconds, one hand holds the other one. I laughed when it clicked and I got the reference. I want to hold your hand. We have, quite literally on the screen, a hand holding another hand. So I'm taking that as a reference to the non-album singles or past masters, which was actually in the works as this video was being filmed. 8 albums down, 6 to go. Now, of course, at this point we've covered everything that I consider to be obvious and on the surface. At this point we go into the murky waters of the debatable references, the ones that are so buried that they might be there and they might not. Next, I noticed that buried down in the outro of When We Was Fab, there seems to be an audio clip of someone speaking, so I decided to try and isolate that to figure out who it is, what they might be saying, to see if it maybe was another reference. I've isolated the clip as well as I can. Have a listen. That is an unidentified woman speaking French. Is there a Beatles song that references a woman speaking French? And is it on one of the missing albums? Yes, it's Michelle from Rubber Soul. That's a song that is also partially sung in French. And there I've isolated what I could from the outro, but Cloud9 is actually now also available in Dolby Atmos. So if there's anyone out there who actually knows how to do it, I bet there's a way to isolate that speech segment and track it and find out who it is speaking. Wouldn't it be interesting if the French lady speaking there turns out to be called Michelle? So anyway, there is our reference to a Rubber Soul song. Now, these final 5 references are the most tenuous ones. But here we go. If you remember, right at the end of the video, George turns into an 8-armed Beatle. But then, right afterwards, he kind of moves his legs into the lotus position as if levitating. A position that, to me at least, makes him look with his still waving 8 limbs a little like an octopus. Could that be a reference to Octopus's Garden from Abbey Road? Possibly. I'd also realised that we had a reference to the Yellow Submarine film and album, we had Help, and we also had the Magical Mystery Tour film and album. So I decided to see if there was anything in the lyrics or the video that referenced anything in the Hard Day's Night film. In the bridge we have various references to the band getting arrested. While you're in this world, the fuzz gonna come and claim you, the buzz gonna come and take you away. Now for those who don't know, fuzz is British slang for the police. Of course this could be a reference to Nobby Pilcher, the copper who went after them for drugs, but it could also reference this scene from A Hard Day's Night, where the Beatles are constantly running away from police officers while Can't Buy Me Love is playing. At this point, we have 10 different references to 10 different Beatles albums by George Harrison in the body of this song or video. At this point, I just find it really hard to believe that this wasn't intentional. There has to be a reference to A Hard Day's Night somewhere in this song, and for me personally, this is the best candidate. And for the final 3 songs, I just did the same thing. I looked at the 3 albums outstanding: Please Please Me, Beatles for Sale and Let It Be. I then went, which song did George sing on that album? And tried to see if there was a reference to it in the video. The first song that George sang on Please Please Me was Chains, and throughout the video we see one of Harrison's many extra arms chained up. On Let It Be we have a Harrison song called For You Blue, and in the last section of When We Was Fab he quotes a Bob Dylan song title, It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. And as it turns out, For You Blue and the Bob Dylan song are actually connected. For You Blue was actually influenced by Bob Dylan, partially inspired by George's stay with Bob in the winter of 1968. And then, last of all, we come to the weirdest one. At this point, I kind of had a candidate for a reference to every single Beatles album, except their 4th one, Beatles for Sale. And the other really puzzling thing that I didn't have any potential explanation for whatsoever was this moment right at the end of the video where George kind of turns into a tree. He sprouts multiple extra versions of himself, and then members presumably of the crew and cast walk underneath the shade of his branches. And so this bizarre scene at the end of the video and the missing album were the 2 remaining jigsaw pieces. Not really knowing where to start, I began going through Beatles lyrics and searching for any reference to trees that might give me any explanation as to what on earth that tree scene is referencing at the end of the music video. And, interestingly, I only really found one candidate. And, of course, it turned out to be the only song that George Harrison sang the lead on Beatles for Sale, Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby, which opens with the line, They took some honey from a tree, dressed it up, and they called it me. And there, at the end of the video, we see George, all dressed up, turning into a tree. Now, is that what the weird scene at the end of When We Was Fab actually means? Who bloody knows? But I was so pleased to have found a final possible reference that was also a song that George sang the lead on the one missing album that I had on my list, that I just took it. And so, there you have it, theoretically at least, definitely with 1 or 2 stretches, a reference to every Beatles song and every Beatles film contained in just one George Harrison single. But on a video and a single like this, just like Free as a Bird, it's absolutely packed with other references that I know I will have missed. So this is where I need your help. Have you noticed any references that I have missed? Have you noticed any better ones that could replace some of the ones that are maybe a little bit of a stretch? Let me know down in the comments below. A huge thank you to all my supporters on Patreon. This video is available on my Patreon ad-free, and I'm also now over halfway through the process of getting my archive of previous videos on there, ad-free as well for tier 2 and 3 supporters, alongside an ever-growing body of extended and bonus content. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't yet, go give When We Was Fab a listen, and as always, I'll see you next time.